The final walkthrough had been going great until it was said. We were standing by the barn away from the realtors, my husband and I, along with the couple we were purchasing the property from, Ralph and Marie. I know how it sounds. You'll think I have a screw loose until you meet him yourself. The old man smiled awkwardly. Just don't speak to the wandering man. It sounds alarming, but he never gave us any trouble. Ralph looked at his wife, and she nodded quickly. Never any trouble, and we've been seeing him less and less, Marie said. When was the last time we even saw him, honey? Oh, Ralph pawed his beard. I'd say 3.5 years ago, and it had been another 2 before that. I was a little disturbed, but could tell my husband, Howard, was getting annoyed. What are you talking about? Some kind of trespasser? He said, frowning. Look, we're giving you a good deal on this place because it wouldn't feel right making a fortune selling it with these circumstances. You're safe here, and that's what matters. But there's a man that wanders these woods. Ralph stared at us gravely, and he has for some 100 years. Howard sighed obnoxiously and stared at the husband and wife, each in turn with disappointment. Anything else we should know? Ghosts in the attic, blood leaking from the walls? The couple looked at each other, embarrassed. I know it's hard to believe when we're talking like this, but we're normal folks. We're just giving you a heads up. I'll tell you what, forget this conversation until you see him. I'm a little sorry I said anything. I just wanted to save you from a fright. Will do. Howard looked up at me and didn't care to hide his growing disdain. The thing was, I liked Ralph. When we drove all the way from Boston to remote Maine to tour the property, Ralph actually looked at me where he felled his trees for firewood and explained how the hydraulic log splitter worked. Most men who owned the properties only spoke to my husband when it came to anything related to farm work. I was the ghost. Howard and I had finally reached the end of a brutal buying process to purchase our homestead in northern New England, and I could see why Howard was angry. There were no such things as ghosts to him. Now, our brand new home had some trespasser he'd be worried about. Come on, Jody, said Howard. He was already walking back to the house. I watched him over my shoulder, but stayed still. I suppose I was more prone to believe in the supernatural. Ralph took off his bald cap and rubbed his bald spot. I'm sorry, we didn't really know how to tell you this. We even thought about rehearsing. He laughed uncomfortably. But I'm deadly serious. He sighed, as if sick of coming across as a madman. When you see him, don't speak to him. You can say hello, he won't respond to that. But if you say anything else... Ralph stared fearfully into the distance as if looking upon the past. Well, don't. Just ignore him and be sure to tell him too. Ralph pointed past me to my husband's back. I nodded. Their sincerity made me want to believe them. They seemed like regular people who understood they were coming across as crazy and were ashamed of it. Thank you two, really. I shook their hands and they both smiled, relieved to be treated normally. I almost thought we were never going to find a place. Well, I don't think we could have found a lovelier couple to sell it to. Across the lawn from the barn, we could see the lake. It was autumn then, and the three of us were quiet as we watched the breeze send a brigade of birch leaves spinning into the cold water. Ralph closed his eyes and took a deep breath. And welcome, he extended his arms. Welcome to heaven on earth. We settled in fast. While I had a marketing job that was fully remote, Howard's job was hybrid. Every week or so, he would have to commute to Bangor to catch a connecting flight at Boston Logan, where he'd be ferried to some project around the country. He worked in engineering consultancy, and while I liked my job, he loved his. He said he didn't mind the extra commute, and I didn't mind being left alone in a house where the nearest neighbor was a mile away. Getting fast enough internet to work from the woods was the biggest hurdle, but after shelling out $200 a month for satellite, we seemed set. I suppose we weren't your average couple who moved from the city to the middle of nowhere, but it made sense. We loved nature and self-sufficiency and didn't utilize the amenities of the city. Neither of us had friends that we saw often anymore, and when it came to family, the further away they were, the better. Maybe there were signs I hadn't seen before, but it was a month after we moved in that I first noticed something was off. It was late, 11 p.m. or so, and I sat alone by a bonfire on the lake shore. Howard, already asleep inside, being the early to bed, early to rise type. I brought my wine to my lips and paused mid-sip. There, a half-mile away on the far side of the lake, a figure was strolling the shore. It was dark, but by the starlight, I was sure it was a person. I leaned forward and frowned. There were 2 other homes in the lake, but the shoreline was largely undeveloped and the woods that lined the lake were impenetrable with thick pine and aspen. Was this him, the harmless, wandering man? I changed my sip to a swig and considered. Ralph had said he'd last seen him years ago, and I thought it was strange he should make an appearance so soon. Then again, maybe this man only wandered at night, and Ralph and Marie rolled. It was likely they couldn't see very far in the dark, and how often did they sit outside at this hour? I had been having bonfires nearly nightly. It was one of the biggest reasons I'd moved out to the rural woods. You see, when I was camping as a girl, I developed a kind of addiction. An addiction to that sensation brought by the stars and the silence of the lonely vacuum of visible space. Maybe you felt it too, sitting alone at night, far from civilization, underneath stars as thick as smoke. We're faced with a nauseating sense of our insignificance. It's at night, with the universe in sight and for scale, that we can see we're barely bigger than bacteria, with lives just as brief and legacies just as remembered. I couldn't get enough of it, of the oneness, of the vulnerability that comes under the vault. Only stepping inside would break the trance. Then, when I woke the next morning, I'd wondered how I'd ever felt so small, smiling in the sunshine, assured and confident in the enormity of myself. But I had a different sensation that night. The feeling of an animal being watched. The feeling of prey. Something was wrong with how he walked, but it took me a minute to realize what it was. His steps never paused or wavered. The lake shore was not a smooth apron of rock. It was strewn with big branches of driftwood and boulders of basalt. If you were to walk it, you'd go slow as you considered your every step. I shivered then. In another few minutes, he was difficult to see, and then he turned into the woodline and disappeared into the pines entirely. "You're safe here," I remember Ralph saying. "Just don't speak to him." I was not afraid of the dark, and I wasn't going to let myself be spooked away from doing what I loved on my own property. I kept having bonfires at night. While I was determined to not let this man ruin my rural evenings, I admit I rarely took my eyes from the opposite shore. It was a few weeks later, and beginning to get cold enough to snow, when I thoroughly began to question the safety of the woods where we lived. I'd finished splitting a quarter cord by hand. I was bent, breathing while palming my knees, when I noticed it. We had an ancient birch tree just past the woodshed, and its removal was on the to-do list as it sat dying with its bark peeling off in scrolls. But sticking out just beneath a bit of bark, something caught my eye. I squinted and walked over. With a finger, I pushed the bark back. There was a carving. I frowned. A carving. Of me. Of my face. It was a crude carving, as if done with a fingernail, but I still smiled when I saw it. My birthday was coming up, and I figured Howard had to be behind it. He was good at drawing, but I'd never heard of him carving before. The alarm bells weren't ringing then. I went inside to find him and wrapped my arms around his shoulders as he sat at his computer. "I'm very sorry, I found you surprise," I said, "but you're very sweet." I kissed his cheek, and he smiled. "What are you talking about? I found you carving out there while chopping wood." He frowned, and I didn't need to hear what he said next to know. "I never carved anything. Where?" My blood ran cold. I took my arms away from his shoulders. "On the dead birch tree." He started to stand. "What's it a carving of?" The two of us stood in the cold and stared at the tree. "This is a joke, right?" He pointed and looked at me and laughed. "Did you do this?" "No, Howard, I didn't carve it. I mean, it's not very flattering, no offense. Why is this something to joke about to you?" He said, and clicked his tongue. "You think this must be the Wandering Man, the one in the woods that kooky old couple warned us about?" "Howard, no, it's okay. I'll handle it. I think I'll give Ralph a call." He started walking away. "Howard!" "What?" "I know you're not going to take me seriously, but I've seen someone on the lake shore late at night." "You're right. I'm not going to take you seriously. So why tell me that in the first place?" "I know what those people said sounded strange, but my gut didn't tell me they were lying." "Guess what? I don't think they were lying either, but they believed crap like that and then tried to scare us the second we finally found a home. They're rude people, Jody, or at least not right in the head. And now this." He pointed at the tree. "What, did they pull a picture of you off the internet and carve this here?" "I don't think so." "Well, who did then?" Things weren't the same after that, both between me and Howard and how I felt on the property. Howard is a sweet man, but I could tell my belief in the supernatural bothered him. Deep down, it probably scared him. He was rarely impatient and condescending to me, and I was frustrated too. We couldn't afford to just try and sell this place and leave. This was our home, and I didn't want to be afraid of here either. That same Sunday, I was watching television late after Howard had gone to bed. It was a perfect night for another fire, clear and cool. But for the first time since we'd moved, I couldn't bring myself to sit outside alone. In fact, I locked the doors for the first time, and while Howard had noticed, I could tell he was relieved I'd done so and said nothing. I was developing the beginnings of paranoid habits. Every hour or so, I would look out the windows, not just the front ones either. I'd go into the kitchen, the den, the pantry, just to stare into the night. On my last round of looking out the windows that night, I turned from the diamond panes of the front door to head up to bed, but paused. I had seen something. I turned back slowly. Just beyond the black where the security light on our garage faded, a man was standing at the edge of the dark. I gasped. My first instinct was to open the door and yell, but then I remembered Ralph's warning. I threw myself up the stairs and went into our bedroom and shook Howard's foot to wake him. "Howard? I think there's someone outside. Please just come see." He sighed and rolled so his feet were on the floor. "Okay, for you." I stood on the stairs while he leaned to look out the window glass in the door. "I don't see anything." He turned back to me. "Just at the edge of the light." I stepped past him and put my eye to the glass. But there was nothing there. My shoulders sank. He was right there, I said quietly, defeated. Jody, I'm sorry I was snappy before, but this is what I'm so frustrated about. Those people put a creepy idea in your head, and now you're seeing what you want to see. I saw someone. I'll order a Ring doorbell tomorrow. You can put up a whole set of security cameras if you want. This is our home. We need to feel safe here. I'll do whatever it takes for you to feel that way. He tried to lay a hand on my shoulder, but I flinched away and stayed staring at the window while he went back upstairs to bed. I did order security cameras, enough for a cartel compound. Camera on the barn, camera on the garage, infrared camera to point across the lake. I was going to feel safe here. Howard was right about that. It was our home. I had to. It cost an entire paycheck, but was worth a peace of mind. However, it brought the opposite. I set up multiple monitors, moved in the coffee maker, and turned my little office into a war room. The first few nights, there was nothing. Then, the fourth night, at 2 a.m, I saw something walking the perimeter of the property. I perked up, splashing my coffee in its cup. Yes, I whispered. Yes, yes, yes. I was more elated than scared. I finally had this thing. Or so I thought. When I played back the footage, I cursed. The figure was just out of range of the cameras. I should have shelled out more and bought only infrared. The lights in the garage and barn weren't going to be bright enough. I still didn't share anything with Howard. While I could make out what I thought was a face and shoulder of this man walking, I knew it wouldn't be enough to convince him. Howard didn't want to believe. The footage would have to be perfect. When I first got the cameras, I forsook sleep and let my marketing work slip. I had to capture an image of this thing. I'd nearly become nocturnal, and my sleep deprivation began to scare me just as much as whatever was in those woods. I left the oven on and open, forgot my husband was home, ran the coffee maker without the pot in it. I was a mess, and I had to hit the brakes. Instead of staying up and watching live, I decided I'd fast forward the footage when I had time the next day. That night, I planned to resume my regular sleep schedule. It was around 11 p.m. when I went upstairs, and I jumped when I opened the bedroom door. Howard was mummied in the sheets. The entire long length of him was draped skin tight from head to toe. I raced over to him, but heard his steady breathing and relaxed. I thought that thing had killed him. I was losing it, I realized. I was really losing it. I took 2 Benadryl and slipped into bed. Miraculously, I slept and later woke in a fright to the bedroom door closing. But it was 4 a.m. and I realized Howard was already up to go for a run. I tossed and turned but couldn't fall back to sleep. The cameras called to me like a siren song. I threw the sheets off me and went downstairs. The house was empty. Howard's running sneakers weren't on the shoe shelf, and I knew I'd have ample time to check the footage without looking like a lunatic. I sat in my chair, but before I could rewind the footage, I froze. On the live screen, the man was staring at the front of the house as still as a street performer and more in view than he'd ever been. His clothes were thick and woolen, but his face was hidden from view. Damn, I said aloud, suddenly realizing he was outside with this thing. Howard! Luckily, he brought his phone to listen to music when he ran, and I dialed him immediately. He answered on one of the latter rings. Jody, what's going on? Howard, I exhaled. Thank Christ, that man is staring at the house right now. What? Are you safe? Jody, it's 4 a.m. There's no one outside. Go back to bed. I'm telling you, I have him on camera this time. Come back. Or no, wait until it's light out. Don't come back until it's daylight. He paused. I think you need to go stay with your parents. I'm safe. I'm inside. Just get back here safely when you can. Jody. His voice was cautious now, as if I was something fragile that could be broken. I'm out of town on a project outside of Dallas right now. Remember? Until Friday? I froze in terror as I stared at that thing on the screen. Then, who is in our bed tonight? What? I let the phone fall to my lap. Howard was yelling loud enough for me to still hear, yelling about getting out of the house. But I couldn't speak anymore. It hadn't been Howard. It was the shape of that thing that I'd seen under the sheets before bed. I pictured it staring at me as I slept. I hung up and walked in a trance to the door. It was unlocked. I had sworn I locked it. I clenched my teeth in anger and threw it open. I stared at the man, and instead of just looking at the house, he was now staring back at me. What do you want with me? I shrieked horribly. Leave me alone, you creep. You hear me? Leave me alone. His head began to tilt to one shoulder, tilting too far. Oh God, I whispered. Oh God. I'd spoken to this thing. I'd broken the only rule. I slammed the door and leaned my back against it. Suddenly, there was a horrible howling that morphed into sobs, the sobs of a grown man crying in the night. But there was something wrong with the noise. It was as if he were only mimicking emotion, like it didn't know what cries were supposed to sound like. Ralph had given me his number, and I fumbled my phone trying to find his contact. As it rang, I managed to turn towards the sound. The crying continued, but that thing was walking calmly towards the house. Its features were wrong. Its legs too long, its hands too big. Suddenly, I saw its eyes the size of tea saucers. It smiled monstrously wide, but the sobs continued. Hello? Came a confused voice on the other line. Ralph, it's Jody. Jody, Cope, I bought your property. It's a bit early, Jody. That thing, the man walking in the woods, he drew a picture of me. He came into my house. He's been watching me, and now I talk to him. Oh dear. I heard him stretch. Okay, are your doors locked? Uh-huh. You said it drew a picture. It carved my face into a tree. Okay, he sighed. I'm sorry. I don't know what to tell you. It ignored me and Marie. But when you spoke to it, what happened? What's it want? When I asked who it was, it showed me what it really looked like, and I suppose a man isn't quite the word for it. But what does it want? I screamed and braved another look out the window. It was even closer now, just a few feet from the door. I ran into the living room. I don't know, said Ralph. I really don't. I'm sorry to say this, but... He paused, and my heart leapt as 3 soft knocks sounded on the door. It sounds like he likes you.